in a rather unbelievable study the year after, in commentary, Lancashire said that as a result of this you should go and see your patient. You should talk to your patient and you should perform a clinical examination. Now, I'm going to talk now a little bit more about what happens in between by looking at Trevarthen and Shaw. But I can't go past Freud at some point. In fact, we're going to go past Freud at several points. Shaw, who I'm going to come to, calls this a monadic impression. Freud is always seen as a sort of singular person, and his theory, which was promulgated, around about a century ago, was about what happened within us. It was an intrapsychic theory about conflict and anxiety and things spilling over. It's a great legacy for people struggling because really office-based therapy, listening can be related to Freud, but his theory was about what happened within rather than what happened between. So I'm going to move on to what happens in between, and this is a classic painting from 1891 by Mary Cassatt, and it graces Daniel Stern's very important book, The Interpersonal World of the Infant, that was published in 1985, and this is a movement to what happens in between. So Trevarthen popularised the term the proto-conversation in the 1970s. The proto-conversation refers to the intimate exchange of facial expression, utterance, baby talk, and movement that occurs between the mother and the baby from the first moments of life. And he said this: mothers align their faces with the baby. Their faces are exaggeratedly mobile in every feature, and these movements are synchronised with gentle but rhythmic and accentuated vocalisations. The infants show intent interest with fixed gaze, knit brow, and slightly pursed lips and relaxed jaw. They exhibit an affectionate pleasure with smiles of varied intensity, coos, and hand movements. So this proto-conversation is a sort of template for what happens between everybody, but begins in the early months of life. It's innate, it's biological, and it's contingent, it's moment to moment. Partners increase their degree of engagement and facially expressed positive emotion together. When emotion becomes too intense, baby looks away, mother backs off, and awaits for cues to come back in again. Responses are very carefully timed. Beebe, an infant researcher, says that this represents a transformation of inner events. Each creates an inner state akin to the other. This is a photograph that I think represents the proto-conversation. And if you look closely, I think in this cycle, with mum and baby gradually amplifying and smiling and having more experience of joy with each other, the baby is just at the highest level and is probably about to turn away. So I'm going to introduce some psychotherapeutic terms now. I think these are really important principles for understanding how people develop, how things go badly wrong, and how they can get better. And the first psychotherapeutic term is called coupling, and that's about being in the same space as somebody in front of you. Matching and representation is an effort to try and reflect an understanding of what's happening in front of you. And amplification for negative affect or negative emotion is bearing witness. We've heard people talk about that today. Being with, not trying to move away from it. And what we don't hear, of course, enough about in mental health is looking for the positives and amplifying them. I think these are very important principles, and I'll probably keep coming back to them quite a lot. So that was in the 1970s. Now, Alan Shaw in 1994 wrote a very seminal textbook called Affect Regulation and the Origin of the Self. He's an American psychologist, and he's one of the first people to start to work in an interdisciplinary way. And what's really important as we go ahead is that we look at pulling disciplines together rather than being in silos. Silos have also been mentioned this morning. There's a number of scientific disciplines that I won't mention there, but what's important is we're starting to talk about regulating emotional, regulating affect, and affect regulation is something that's very important that people are talking about more and more now. But you can see from this book that was written nearly 20 years ago, it's not still got a good foothold, even though Alan Shaw comes here and will talk to 600 people at a time. So he looks at infant development and pathology, but relates this to adult pathology, and I think this is a really good starting point for looking at what happens in between. I don't mean to suggest when I talk about this that I think that all pathology starts at this point. I just think it's a way of looking at things. Unfortunately, he looks a bit like Freud. So, in developmental neuroscience, this is seen as probably the biggest paradigm shift for decades and decades and decades. This is a movement to what happens in between two people, the intersubjective. And Shaw says events that occur during infancy, especially transactions within the social environment, are indelibly imprinted into the structures that are maturing in the first years of life. The child's first relationship, the one with the mother, acts as a template as it permanently moulds the individual's capacities to enter into all later emotional relationships. These early experiences shape the development of a unique personality, its adaptive capacities as well as its vulnerabilities to and resistances against particular forms of future pathologies. Indeed, they profoundly influence the emergent organisation of an integrated system that is both stable and adaptable, and thereby the formation of the self. Now, Shaw goes on to say that what's most important is eye contact, mutual gaze. He writes that the mother's emotionally expressive face is by far the most potent visual stimulus in the infant's environment, and the child's intense interest in her face, especially in her eyes, leads him or her to track it in space and to engage in periods of intense mutual gaze. He calls this the co-creation of a dyadic or two-part attachment system, which allows the caregiver, or later on I might say therapist, to regulate the child's affective states. The mother can amplify positive states and minimise negative affective states. The good enough mother transition from one state to another. Of course, one can be misattuned, either by virtue of depression or neglect, psychosis, and Shaw particularly focuses on shame. He also says that issues here can be the precursors of dissociation, and how long the child remains in an intense negative affective state is thought to be crucial in the development of later pathology. And if we're lucky, we've got a little video now which can be a little emotional about a mum and a babe.
Extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Are we good? That's the sort of template that I'm talking about. That's a healthy mother and a healthy baby, and you can see how difficult it can get and how quickly it can also be recovered. But that's the sort of template I'm talking about. This relationship between mother and baby is so important that the total brain volume doubles in the first year. The subcortical structures, which are much more important in emotional regulation, increase by 130%. Shaw calls this experience-dependent maturation. So we might say that the mother not only creates the brain tissue but also the programs. Now I'm going to talk, as the title of my talk indicates, about left and right brain, left and right. Shaw says verbal, conscious and serial information processing takes place in the left hemisphere. Unconscious, non-verbal and emotional processing in the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is dominant for the first 3 to 4 years of life, and the right orbitofrontal cortex is the hierarchical apex of over the limbic or the emotional system, which is much more unconscious. And this is a major control system over all the autonomic nervous system, hence we have regulation as well. And Ledoux says if a significant proportion of the early emotional experiences one has are due to activation of the fear system rather than the positive system, then the characteristic personality that begins to build up is one characterised by negativity and hopelessness. Severe attachment trauma may damage these right hemisphere circuits. This might affect the capacity to play. That's a word that we mention in psychotherapy but never in mental health, and we should do it much more frequently, of course. Attachment, empathy, affect regulation. These are all related to mental health. People have seen the Romanian orphans. They simply headbang because that's the only comfort they can get. It's the only stimulation they can get. This right hemisphere pattern, this is what I'm going to talk about a lot. The non-conscious hemisphere would account for the non-verbal nature of much traumatic memory. That is, it cannot necessarily be remembered or spoken. Cannot necessarily be remembered or spoken. And Shaw says brains are plastic, co-created in the context of the mother-infant died. Sequelae of early abuse and deprivation may take many forms or may predispose to problems later on. Some adults may not even have the hardware, let alone the software. They can't be told to snap out of it. This model of understanding the importance of affective interchange could be applied to development of pathology at other developmental stages, and therapeutic responses that are empathic are much more likely to be helpful.